Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the Four Nations tournament happening in February of this season, just a couple of months away. Actually, it is going to be replacing the All-Star game this year, and is where the players of four different countries, Canada, USA, Sweden, and Finland, are coming together to play for their respective national teams in a best-on-best tournament. And the rosters for these four teams have been announced today, and what's important to us is which San Jose Sharks players did make it and which ones just barely missed out. We start off with Team Finland. The only player who will be representing the Sharks organization in February at this tournament is Mikael Granlund. Team Finland doesn't quite have the same level of depth as a Team Canada or a Team USA, and so Granlund was essentially a shoo-in for this position. Also, because he has just been really great for the Sharks, not just this year, where you could certainly argue he's been the best player, but also last year, where he definitely was the Sharks' best player. But he also brings just a ton of value to the table as well. He is a centerman, he plays the power play, he plays the penalty kill, he's somewhat defensively responsible, he is an experienced player as well. So while he is not going to be the big name leading this team to victory, like that might go to Mikko Rantanen or Sebastian Aho, he will likely still play a sizable role for the likely underdog Finnish team. However, what is more interesting to talk about is not the guaranteed player here for San Jose, but the players who did end up missing out. And we move now to Team Canada. Canada, as I mentioned, they have a ton of depth at both forward and defense. That makes it an extremely competitive roster to make it onto. But at goalie, Canada has been struggling. A decade ago, when Team Canada was winning gold medals in 2014 and 2010 at the Olympic Games, they had legendary names like Brodeur, like Luongo, like Carey Price. These days, however, the goaltending pool from Canada is a lot weaker, which gave Sharks goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood a very real chance of making it. Now, I am a bit sad that he didn't end up getting into it, but I do somewhat understand it with the names that were above him. The two big ones that did make it to Team Canada being Adin Hill and Jordan Binnington. While these are not the greatest goaltenders that the NHL has to offer currently, they did both backstop their respective teams to Stanley Cup victories, so I can understand why that is the case. The one goaltender who obviously does stand out here as the odd man out is Sam Montembeault with the Montreal Canadiens. While I definitely think that Mackenzie Blackwood's stats are better than Montembeault's have been this season, and so he should have been the obvious choice above him, the goaltender that also got snubbed, the bigger snub here, is probably Logan Thompson with the Washington Capitals. The Sharks just played against them yesterday. We saw how good Thompson has been. His stats have been even better than both Blackwood and Montembeault's this season, and so considering he backstopped the Capitals to a surprising first place current spot in the Eastern Conference, he probably should have been that third goalie. So I view Blackwood more so fourth down on the list, so it's not the end of the world that he didn't get this spot. Where there is the bigger snub is definitely with Team Sweden. In the months and the weeks leading up to this announcement, there were rumors that one, if not both, of Zetterlund and Eklund would be able to make it to Team Sweden. Just yesterday I talked about Eklund's possible inclusion, considering it had leaked out that he was likely to make the team. But today in the announcement we found out that neither did. In the case of Zetterlund, I'm not that upset about this. I view him as a good player. He has been a solid player for the Sharks both this year and last, and I do think he would be fine, and I would have been happy to see him in this role. But do I think he would be a huge impact player in a best-on-best tournament? Not necessarily. However, for William Eklund, I don't just view him as a good player, I view him as a great player, and I think he would have been a great choice for Team Sweden. A lot of the times that the argument you might use against a younger player is, well, they're not going to get a top 6 spot and so they're not going to succeed. But the way William Eklund plays the game, he is the type of guy who would absolutely thrive in a best-on-best fourth line position. Just his ability to grind things out along the boards is extremely valuable for that type of slot. And then, like when it comes to Mikael Granlund, he eats up big minutes, he plays the power play, he plays the penalty kill, he's somewhat defensively responsible, so I don't really see why he ends up getting excluded, especially since if you just take a look offensively, he's one of the highest scoring Sweden-born players in the entire league this season. He was also very good for the Sharks last year, even though the Sharks were one of the worst teams the NHL has seen in like a couple of decades. Now, of course, when you talk about a snub, you have to talk about the players who he should be replacing, and there are a couple of names on Team Sweden that I would recommend. There are actually even maybe a couple more than that if you were to go to just generally forwards, but if we stick in just the winger position, there are two names definitely. The first of which is former San Jose Shark Gustav Nyquist, who has not been very good with the Nashville Predators this season. Admittedly, the Predators as a whole have been struggling, so it's not entirely on Nyquist, but still, 10 points thus far this season is not that great. And considering he is 35 years of age, one could, theorize that this might just be a general downturn in terms of play in his career. 35 years of age is where you would expect a player to begin to fall off at least a little bit. So this might not just be a cold streak. You may have just brought onto your Four Nations roster a player who's just not very good anymore. But when it comes to Nyquist, at least I can somewhat understand it, because just last year he did have a career year with 75 points. So you might be leaning on that. The player who I don't really understand is Victor Arvidsson. Now, I'm a Victor Arvidsson fan. I still remember his performance for the Nashville Predators against the Sharks back at the 2016 playoffs. He scored that overtime game winner in Game 6 to force the all-deciding Game 7 back in San Jose, and I thought at the time that he would end up becoming a pretty good player in the NHL, and indeed, he ended up doing exactly that. But if you take a look at his stats this season, he's only played 16 games for the Oilers due to long-term injuries that have kept him out, and during that time, he only has 5 points. Very not good, and it's not as though he's getting like 0 minutes a night. He has been playing a sizable amount for an elite Oilers offense that hasn't been that great this season, but should be historically. And so those 5 points is not very good, but you might be using the same argument as a Gustav Nyquist. Well, what did he do last year? He only played 18 games in the NHL regular season last season, plus 5 games in the playoffs. Eklund has played more games this season, not even halfway through the year, than Arvidsson did all of last year. And so you're depending on a player's performance from 2 years ago to have made your decision here. And even then, he just barely missed out on 60 points in that particular year, a good performance, but Eklund is on pace to eclipse that point total this season thus far. And so to me, depending on a player who has basically not even played half of an NHL regular season over the last 2 years is a little bit silly, because in a tournament in which you're coming down to just a few games, a player like that who's going to give you an unreliable performance just doesn't make much sense compared to Eklund, who should be more of a sure thing. Now, at the end of the day, you might be wondering, well, does this really matter? The Four Nations tournament is kind of just an arbitrary tournament introduced by the NHL that doesn't really mean much in a sort of historical time, sort of a time frame, compared to, let's say, 8 years ago, we had the World Cup of Hockey, which was fun to watch at the time, but is kind of viewed as a little bit irrelevant in the grand scheme of things historically. I personally don't even remember who won the World Cup of Hockey 8 years ago, and so the Four Nations tournament may very well go in that same direction. But it does need to be noted that this is viewed as much more of like a stepping stone towards the Olympics next year. And so while team players obviously didn't grow up hoping to represent their countries at the Four Nations, they did grow up hoping to represent their countries at the Olympics. And this is going to be a very good stage to show what you are capable of to be able to make it to your Olympic team next season. I imagine a lot of the people who decided on Team Canada and Team USA here are going to be making those same types of decisions next year as well. And so look at a player like Leo Carlsson on Team Sweden. If he does well at this Four Nations, that gives him a very good chance of making it to Team Sweden next season. This is not an advantage that William Eklund will have. Obviously, if he performs super well to end off this season in the NHL and then does the same thing at the beginning of next year, he could definitely still make it anyway, but his chances have been hurt by his absolute snub for the roster this season. So definitely disappointing to see him miss out, and I don't know about any other Sharks fans, but due to my pettiness, I will definitely be rooting against Team Sweden at this tournament in February. Class dismissed.